The price tag for Operation Epic Fury just hit a level that has even the most seasoned budget hawks on the Hill doing a double take. Yesterday, Tuesday, the administration officially moved for a $200 billion supplemental appropriation to fund the ongoing military campaign in Iran. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire annual budget for the Department of Energy, the Department of Justice, and NASA combined.
It's a staggering amount of money, especially considering we are only in the fourth week of this conflict. Representative Betty McCollum, a Democrat from Minnesota and the ranking member of the House Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, made it very clear in the record yesterday that she is losing patience with the lack of transparency. She specifically said, and I'm quoting here, "I will not write blank checks to the Department of Defense." She's pointing to the fact that this $200 billion comes on top of $150 billion the Pentagon already received through a recent reconciliation package.
And McCollum isn't just looking at the top-line numbers. She's connecting this to the human cost back in her district. She spoke about Master Sergeant Nicole Amore, a constituent from White Bear Lake, Minnesota, who was among the 13 American service members killed since these strikes began on February 28th. It's that intersection of a massive fiscal request and the arrival of flag-draped coffins that is turning the temperature up in both chambers.
The Senate certainly felt that heat yesterday. Senator Chris Murphy, a Democrat from Connecticut, tried to force the body's hand by moving to discharge a War Powers Resolution, S.J. Res. 116, from the Foreign Relations Committee. Since we have a bit more room to breathe today, we can really dig into the mechanics of this. Usually, a bill like this can languish in committee forever, but Murphy used a specific provision in the 1973 War Powers Resolution to try and bypass the committee and bring it straight to the floor for a vote.
The vote failed, 47 to 53, which was largely along party lines, but the outliers are what's interesting. Senator Rand Paul, a Republican from Kentucky, crossed over to vote with the Democrats to discharge the resolution. On the other side, Senator John Fetterman, a Democrat from Pennsylvania, was the lone defection from his party, voting with the Republicans to keep the resolution bottled up in committee.
That Fetterman vote is a notable data point, given how unified the rest of the caucus was. But look at the rhetoric from the floor leading up to that. Senator Murphy was incredibly sharp. He pointed out that despite being a month into what he called the most significant conflict in the Middle East in most of our careers, the Senate has not held a single public hearing, not in foreign relations, not in armed services. The administration is essentially running a war via press release and Truth Social posts.
Murphy's biggest grievance, and this was echoed by Senator Tim Kaine, a Democrat from Virginia, is the shifting rationale. In the record, Murphy notes that the goals have moved from destroying nuclear programs to regime change, and now the primary objective is simply reopening the Strait of Hormuz. As Murphy put it, the strait was open before the war began. We are now seeking to solve a problem that we created. This is insanity.
Wait, let's play devil's advocate for a second. If you look at what Senator Jim Risch, a Republican from Idaho, argued yesterday, he says the insanity is actually the Democratic attempt to pull back. Risch is the ranking member of Foreign Relations, and he framed this as a conflict that's been 47 years in the making, dating back to the 1979 hostage crisis. His take is that Iran has been killing Americans for decades with roadside bombs and proxies, and the president finally said enough. Risch even directed a message straight to Tehran from the Senate floor, saying, "Breaking news, no one is coming to help you."
Risch's stance is that any debate right now is effectively aiding the enemy. He told the Democrats, "You are the only entity on this planet trying to help the Iranians. Stop it." But that hasn't stopped the economic alarm bells from ringing in the House. Representative Marcy Kaptur, a Democrat from Ohio, gave a 1-minute speech that was basically a list of price hikes in the Buckeye State. She noted gas is up over $1 in a month, and diesel is hitting $5 a gallon.
Kaptur's point is that this is a de facto tax on the American heartland. When diesel hits $5, the cost of moving fertilizer goes up, which means the cost of corn and soy goes up. And suddenly, that $200 billion supplemental doesn't feel like just a military number, it feels like an inflationary bomb. She used very strong language, calling it an undeclared Trump illegal war, and saying the American people deserve a president who abides by the Constitution.
And the troop movements are accelerating. Representative Adam Schiff, a Democrat from California, brought up the mobilization at Camp Pendleton. He noted that over 2,500 Marines are currently aboard the USS Portland, the USS Comstock, and the USS Boxer, heading for the Middle East. He also mentioned Chief Warrant Officer Robert Marzan from Sacramento, who was killed on the second day of the war. Schiff was clearly frustrated, asking if the Senate's red line had just disappeared.
Schiff used a great quote from Herbert Hoover to drive home the generational divide. Older men declare war, but it is the youth that must fight and die. He's looking at these Marines from San Diego and the 3,000 soldiers from the 82nd Airborne at Fort Bragg who are reportedly being deployed, and he's asking, for what? Is it for regime change? Is it to lower gas prices? Because so far, it's doing the opposite of the latter.
While the Democrats are focused on the legality of the war, the Republicans yesterday were pivoting the conversation back to domestic security, but in a way that connects to the broader funding fight. Senator Eric Schmitt, a Republican from Missouri, took the floor and didn't talk about Iran at all. He talked about Chicago. Specifically, the murder of an 18-year-old college student named Sheridan Gorman, who was allegedly killed by an illegal alien from Venezuela.
Schmidt's pivot is fascinating from a tactical perspective. He's basically saying, you want to talk about the government's failure to protect people? Let's talk about sanctuary cities. He argued that the same administration, asking for hundreds of billions for a war in the Middle East, is failing to enforce immigration laws at home. He called it suicidal empathy, and argued that the government's first obligation is to protect its own citizens in the streets of Chicago and Missouri, not just in the Strait of Hormuz.
It's a powerful rhetorical move because it reframes the war powers debate into a priority debate. Schmitt asked, whose country is this? He's linking the lack of border enforcement to the same constitutional crisis that the Democrats are claiming regarding the war. He even suggested that Democrats value undocumented migrants more than American citizens like Sheridan Gorman. It's an incredibly polarizing take, but it explains why the Republicans are so hesitant to grant that $200 billion in unrestricted funding without some massive concessions on domestic policy.
Exactly. And you see that reflected in Senator Tammy Baldwin's remarks. The Wisconsin Democrat did the math on the floor. She said the $30 billion we've already spent on Operation Epic Fury in just 3 weeks is the exact amount it would cost to extend the Affordable Care Act's tax credits for an entire year, or pay for school lunches for 30 million children. Her argument is that the administration is making a choice, prioritizing a deadly vanity project over the kitchen table issues that actually affect Wisconsin families.
The administration's counter-argument, though, is that the kitchen table is currently being hammered by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Senator Kaine from Virginia pointed out that the USS Ford Carrier Strike Group has had its deployment extended for the third time. These sailors were supposed to be home for Christmas. Now they are seeing fires in the laundry rooms and smoke inhalation injuries because the ship is being run ragged. Kaine's point is that the human cost is mounting on our own ships due to poor planning.
Kaine's detail about the USS Ford is vital. When you extend a carrier's deployment to 9 months, the maintenance starts to fail. The plumbing goes, then the mechanical systems, and eventually you have sailors getting hurt in preventable fires. It's a vivid illustration of a military being stretched to its breaking point for a mission that the Senate hasn't even debated yet. He called it waging war on autopilot.
And Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, a Democrat from New York, closed it out by saying that the American people are tired of endless wars. He warned that keeping the strategy secret from the public is a loser for the country. But despite all that fiery rhetoric, the motion to discharge failed. The status quo remains. The war continues, the troops are moving, and the $200 billion bill is sitting on the table.
Which leads us to the next big standoff. If the administration can't get that war funding through a clean supplemental, they're going to try to tuck it into the next consolidated appropriations bill. And that brings us to the leverage game currently being played with our nation's airports. If you thought gas prices were the only travel headache coming out of the record yesterday, wait until you hear how the shutdown is hitting the TSA.
The conversation around who gets to participate in American democracy is shifting from the polling place to the statistical architecture of the country itself. Yesterday, Tuesday, Senator Bill Hagerty, a Republican from Tennessee, introduced a pair of amendments that would fundamentally change the decennial census. Since we have a bit more room to look at the mechanics here, it's helpful to see how this connects to the broader funding fight. These amendments, collectively called the Equal Representation Act, were filed to S. 1383, which the record shows is the Save America Act. The goal is straightforward but technically complex, mandating a citizenship checkbox on the 2030 census.
And it's that checkbox that acts as the trigger for the really significant change. Currently, the Census Bureau counts every person living in the United States, regardless of legal status, to determine how many seats each state gets in the House of Representatives. Hagerty's proposal would require the Secretary of Commerce to not only include that citizen status checkbox, but also to release state-level data within 120 days, showing the exact breakdown of citizens versus non-citizens. From there, the amendment would rewrite a nearly century-old law, the 1929 Census Act, to explicitly exclude non-citizens from the population count used for congressional apportionment and the Electoral College.
The language in the record for Senate Amendment 4778 is very specific about this. It says the Secretary shall include a checkbox for the respondent to indicate, quote, whether that individual is a citizen of the United States. It then moves to the apportionment clause, directing that the count shall exclude individuals who are not citizens of the United States. This is a direct challenge to the traditional interpretation of the 14th Amendment, which says representatives shall be apportioned based on the whole number of persons in each state.
That's the core of the debate. Proponents like Senator Hagerty and 18 Republican co-sponsors, including Mike Lee of Utah and Rick Scott of Florida, argue that including non-citizens in the count dilutes the voting power of citizens. They point to states like California or Texas, where large non-citizen populations might result in more House seats than those states would have if only citizens were counted. The argument is that this creates an incentive for states to encourage immigration to boost their political weight in Washington. It's a move that could potentially shift dozens of seats away from high immigrant states toward the Midwest and the South.
The transcript shows this wasn't just a quiet filing in the clerk's office. It was the backdrop for a very pointed exchange on the floor. Senator John Thune, the Republican from South Dakota, led the argument for these types of eligibility requirements. He framed the idea of proving citizenship as a routine part of American life. He used the example of signing kids up for Little League or public school. According to the record, Thune said, Americans are more than used to providing documentation, whether that is a birth certificate, social security card, photo ID, or a passport. I don't think it is too burdensome to suggest that we require some of that same documentation for voting.
Thune's Little League analogy was a way of pushing back on the Democratic claim that these requirements are a form of voter suppression. He was essentially asking, if you need a birth certificate to play baseball or start a job, why is it considered a barrier for the most fundamental right in a democracy? He even went after the argument that married women might be disenfranchised if their last names don't match their birth certificates, noting that the Save America Act allows for an affidavit to testify to a name change. He characterized the Democratic opposition as having a poor opinion of their own voters' ability to handle basic paperwork.
That's where Senator Dick Durbin, the Democrat from Illinois, stepped in to provide a completely different set of numbers. Durbin didn't focus on the theory of the bureaucracy. He focused on the frequency of the problem. He cited data from 1999 to 2023, a 24-year period, to question the necessity of the entire bill. Here is how he put it on the record. 77 people in the United States of America, in a 24-year period of time, tried to vote when they were not legally entitled to vote. 77 people. So the Republicans want us to change all of the laws on registration across the United States because of 77 people over a 24-year period of time.
It's a classic statistical standoff. Thune is looking at the principle of eligibility, while Durbin is looking at the rarity of the violation. Durbin also brought up the actual cost of these requirements. He pointed out that while a birth certificate might be in a closet somewhere, a passport costs $165. He called that a poll tax in everything but name. If you're one of the 50 million people who register to vote every year and you don't have your papers handy, that $165 fee becomes a literal price of admission to the booth. He's arguing that the solution being proposed is out of proportion to a problem that, by his count, barely exists.
Democratic leader Chuck Schumer of New York took it a step further. He called the Republican focus on voter ID a cover-up for what he claims is the real goal of the Save America Act, purging the voter rolls. Schumer alleged that the bill would lead to 20 million people being kicked off the rolls, often without their knowledge, because they can't navigate the new verification hurdles. He linked this back to the broader DHS funding crisis, claiming that Donald Trump's temper tantrum over the SAVE Act is what's preventing TSA workers and the Coast Guard from being paid.
Schumer also highlighted something that's been happening at airports lately: the deployment of ICE agents to security checkpoints. He described them as intimidation forces rather than security personnel, noting that they aren't trained for traveler screening. He even quoted former Trump advisor Steve Bannon, who apparently called this ICE deployment a test run to perfect the agency's involvement in the 2026 elections. So you have this collision where the debate over the census, the voter rolls, and the literal presence of law enforcement at airports are all merging into one large argument about the 2026 midterms.
This whole debate is happening while the 2030 census is still years away, but the planning cycles in the government are long. Senator Hagerty's amendment includes a severability clause, which is a detail that caught my eye in the transcript. It basically says that if a court finds the apportionment change unconstitutional, which many legal scholars expect, given the 14th Amendment's persons language, the rest of the act, like the citizenship checkbox itself, should remain in place. It suggests they are preparing for a multi-stage legal battle over how we define the American electorate.
It's about building a data set. Even if they can't legally exclude non-citizens from the count yet, having that checkbox on the 2030 census creates an official government record of where those individuals are. That data can then be used for future redistricting fights at the state level. It's a long-game strategy. While the floor debate gets heated over 77 cases of fraud or $165 passport fees, the technical changes being proposed to the Census Act are designed to have consequences that last for decades, long after this specific funding fight is over.
The record from yesterday, Tuesday, also shows how this domestic friction is bleeding into foreign policy. While the Senate was stuck on these voter amendments, Senator Jerry Moran, a Republican from Kansas, took the floor to pivot toward energy and sanctions. He was critical of the administration's decision to waive oil sanctions on Russia and Iran, arguing that it funnels billions to adversaries. It's a reminder that even when the Senate seems entirely consumed by the mechanics of the next election, the global implications of a stalled government continue to pile up.
It all feels like a precursor to the 2026 midterms. Whether it's the Equal Representation Act or the fight over TSA paychecks, every move on the floor is being viewed through the lens of how it changes the map. And speaking of changing maps and shifting power, the Senate is also starting to look at a different kind of influence, one that isn't about the voters, but the massive companies that provide their services.
That's exactly where we're going next. We're moving from the fight over who gets to vote to the fight over who controls the tools we use every day. Up next, the populist push targeting AI monopolies and the healthcare giants. The record from yesterday, Tuesday, suggests a really fascinating shift in the air. We've spent so much time talking about procedural standoffs and funding fights. But beneath that surface, there is this brewing bipartisan appetite for trust-busting. It's coming from very different corners of the chamber, but the target is the same: massive corporate concentration. We saw this most clearly when Senator Bernie Sanders, an independent from Vermont, took the floor to sound a massive alarm about the trajectory of artificial intelligence.
Sanders wasn't just talking about chatbots or deepfakes, though those were on his list. He was framing AI as the most profound technological revolution in human history. He used a comparison from Demis Hassabis, the head of Google's DeepMind, saying the AI revolution will be 10 times bigger than the Industrial Revolution and 10 times faster. Since we have a bit more room to roam in this episode, it's worth looking at the numbers Sanders put on the record. He noted that 4 AI companies are spending nearly $700 billion this year alone on data centers. As a percentage of GDP, that's 10 times what we spent annually on the moon landings.
The sheer scale of that infrastructure is what led to his big announcement. Sanders is introducing legislation for a federal moratorium on new AI data centers. He's looking at the impact on the power grid and the environment, but primarily, he's looking at the labor market. He cited a report from his own committee, the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, which estimated that AI could replace nearly 100 million jobs in America over the next decade. He mentioned truck drivers, accountants, even 89% of fast food workers. His argument is that we need a cooling-off period to decide how this works for everyone, not just the people at the top.
And the quote that really stuck with me was when he said, "A moratorium will give the American people the time to determine how we can make AI and robotics work for them, not just a few wealthy people." It's a classic Sanders framing, but he's drawing on a letter from 3 years ago, signed by over 1,000 experts, including Elon Musk, who called for a similar pause. Sanders is essentially saying Congress has been paralyzed by a corrupt campaign finance system, while tech oligarchs decide the future of the human race. It's a heavy take, but it's finding resonance in local communities that are already blocking these data centers because they're jacking up electricity rates by as much as 200%.
It's interesting, because you see that same populist energy, that same distrust of massive vertically integrated systems, popping up on the Republican side of the House. Representative Greg Murphy, a Republican from North Carolina and a urologist by trade, gave a scathing speech yesterday, Tuesday, targeting the healthcare giants. He wasn't talking about AI labs. He was talking about insurance conglomerates like United Healthcare. Murphy's 35 years as a provider in rural areas clearly informed his take. He argued that the healthcare payment system is essentially sicker than the patients it's supposed to serve.
Murphy's focus was on what he called criminal vertical integration. He pointed out that United Healthcare isn't just an insurer anymore. Through its subsidiaries, it owns the doctor's offices, the pharmacies, the surgery centers, and even a bank. When one company controls every step of the transaction, competition dies. He was particularly focused on allegations of Medicare Advantage fraud. He presented data showing that United's doctors were diagnosing conditions like senile purpura or obstructed leg arteries at rates hundreds of times higher than traditional Medicare. He estimated this kind of upcoding cost taxpayers $50 billion a year.
He didn't mince words. He said, companies like United, which have destroyed the market with a profit-first, patient-last vertical integration, need to be broken up to restore competition in the marketplace. It's a striking thing to hear from a GOP member, but it shows how much the cost of living is driving this. Murphy noted that the average health insurance premium for a family of 4 is now $27,000 a year. He blames the Affordable Care Act for codifying this insurer dominance, but his solution, the forced breakup of these giants, is an aggressive move that wouldn't have sounded out of place coming from Sanders.
This whole debate over corporate power and price gouging gets even messier when you look at what Representative Seth Magaziner, a Democrat from Rhode Island, brought to the floor. He connected these economic frustrations directly to systemic corruption in Washington. He gave a 1-minute speech that was essentially a lightning round of allegations against the executive branch and his own colleagues. He mentioned Corey Lewandowski allegedly demanding fees for DHS contracts, and Tom Homan allegedly being caught on tape accepting $50,000 in cash from undercover agents.
Magaziner also went after the president's personal finances, specifically billions made in cryptocurrency sales, and a dissolved library fund where $63 million from tech giants like Meta and X reportedly vanished. But he didn't stop at the executive branch. He turned the lens on Congress itself, calling out the fact that members are still trading stocks in the very companies they regulate. He even mentioned lawmakers using online prediction markets to bet on whether the bills they're writing will actually pass. To Magaziner, this isn't just an ethics issue. It's the reason why the cost of food and healthcare is out of control.
He put it quite bluntly. If you want to know why big corporations are given a free pass by Washington to jack up prices and gouge people, this is why. It's a powerful line of reasoning that ties all these threads together. Whether it's Sanders worrying about AI oligarchs or Murphy trying to dismantle healthcare monopolies, there's a growing sense on the floor that the regulators are too financially entangled with the regulated. Magaziner is pushing hard for a total ban on congressional stock trading, and the momentum for that seems to be building as these stories of $50,000 cash in paper bags start hitting the record.
It's a rare moment where the far left and the conservative caucus are staring at the same set of problems, even if they disagree on the exact legislative fix. The common denominator is this feeling that the scale of these entities, whether they are tech firms building city-sized data centers or insurance giants owning every clinic in town, has outpaced the government's ability to provide oversight, especially when that oversight is being handled by people who might be profiting from the status quo.
The focus on institutional integrity didn't end with corporate oversight, though. While Magaziner and Murphy were focused on the suits in the boardrooms and the halls of power, other members were looking at the people who actually wear the government's uniform. And that brings us to a very different kind of accountability debate. Up next, accountability for the uniform.
That shift toward accountability isn't just limited to the boardrooms, though. It's also reaching into the agencies themselves, particularly when it comes to the people we trust to wear the uniform.
Right. And this isn't exactly a standard debate about military readiness. Yesterday, Tuesday, Senator Ron Wyden, DOR, pulled a procedural lever that usually stays in the background. He filed a formal notice of intent to object to the promotions of 3 specific military officers.
And for anyone who doesn't live in the Senate rules book, a single senator can effectively halt a unanimous consent request, which is how most of these big batches of promotions move through. Wyden is using that power to force a public conversation about some very dark chapters in military history. He's dragging names out of the personnel files and into the record.
He's focusing on 3 men: Lieutenant Colonel Vincent Noble, Lieutenant Commander Thomas McNeil, and Colonel Thomas Sieverts. The allegations Wyden put into the record are specific, and frankly, they're difficult to read. With Noble, we're looking back at a 2007 incident in Afghanistan, where his platoon killed 19 civilians.
Wyden was blunt about it. He said, allowing Marines under an officer's command to kill civilians indiscriminately is a serious war crime. According to the record, a military inquiry found that Noble's platoon went on a rampage across a 7-mile stretch of highway after a suicide bomb attack. Wyden alleges Noble told his Marines to lie and submitted false reports to cover it up.
What's interesting is the institutional gap here. Noble actually pleaded guilty to conduct unbecoming back in 2008. But here we are, nearly 20 years later, and his name is on a promotion list. Wyden is asking a fundamental question. If the military's own system found him guilty of those actions, why is he being recommended for a higher rank now?
It's a question of where the unbecoming label ends and career progression begins. The same tension shows up with Thomas McNeil. He was part of the SEAL platoon in Mosul, where Chief Edward Gallagher was accused of war crimes. McNeil eventually testified against Gallagher. But Wyden is pointing to photos McNeil took posing with the body of a deceased captive.
And this is where it gets political, because the record mentions that former President Trump and the acting Navy Secretary at the time intervened to stop disciplinary reviews for that platoon. Wyden is basically saying that a political intervention doesn't scrub the conduct from the record. If you exercised poor judgment then, he argues, you shouldn't be promoted now.
Then, there's Colonel Thomas Sieverts. This one is much more recent, March 2023. He appeared on a podcast called The Berm Pit, which Wyden characterizes as a racist and anti-Semitic platform. He's been asking the Marine Corps for a copy of the episode for months to verify what was said, but the record shows they haven't handed it over.
It's a fascinating bottleneck. You have the military bureaucracy saying, these men are ready for the next level. And you have a senator saying, I've read their files and I disagree. It puts a spotlight on a vetting process that usually happens behind a curtain of secrecy.
And it's happening alongside a very different debate about accountability, this one at the Department of Justice. Senator John Barrasso, RYWY, was on the floor yesterday, Tuesday, pushing for the confirmation of Colin McDonald to lead the new National Fraud Enforcement Division.
Barrasso framed this as a must-have for the taxpayer. He cited some pretty wild numbers from Minnesota, where a Medicaid program for children with autism went from a $6 million price tag to $193 million in just 5 years. He called the Treasury an ATM for crooks and said McDonald is the prosecutor to shut it down.
But Senator Dick Durbin, DIL, isn't buying the fraud fighter label. He's looking at McDonald's leadership of the Weaponization Working Group. Durbin alleged that this group, which includes an individual who participated in the January 6th Capitol riot, is designed to name and shame political opponents rather than investigate actual crimes.
So you have these two parallel tracks of accountability running through the Senate. One side is trying to hold individual officers accountable for their past conduct in the field, while the other side is debating whether a new fraud division is an oversight tool or a political weapon. Both sides are using the word accountability, but they mean very different things.
It all points to a deep distrust of the internal vetting systems, whether it's the military's promotion boards or the DOJ's internal ethics. When the standard process doesn't satisfy the Senate, the floor becomes the courtroom.
Which, ironically, is where a lot of these folks would rather be, instead of stuck in the gridlock that's currently defining the Hill. Or stuck in traffic, for that matter.
Speaking of traffic, the House spent some time yesterday, Tuesday, looking at how to skip the gridlock entirely by flying at twice the speed of sound. They took up the Supersonic Aviation Modernization Act, or the SAM Act, which passed with a massive bipartisan majority.
It's a fascinating bit of futurism. We usually hear Congress debating things that happened last year. But here they are trying to undo a regulatory ban that's been in place since 1973. For over 50 years, if you were in a civil aircraft, you had a functional speed limit of Mach 1 over U.S. soil.
Because of the sonic boom, if you were on the ground in Kansas, you didn't want your windows rattling every time a flight went from New York to L.A. But Representative Taylor, ROH, argued on the floor yesterday that the tech has finally caught up to the ambition. He said, think of the possibilities. D.C. to Los Angeles in just 2 hours.
2 hours. You could almost commute across the country. But the engineering challenge is significant. The bill, H.R. 3410, requires the FAA to set noise standards by April 1st, 2027. The catch is, these supersonic jets have to be as quiet as the subsonic planes we use now during takeoff and landing.
And they can't let a sonic boom reach the ground. Representative Figures, DAL, joined the support, noting that the aviation industry is already moving towards sustainable fuels for these jets. He's looking at it as a way to reclaim American aerospace leadership from foreign competitors who are working on similar tech.
The transcript shows a lot of focus on that leadership angle. Representative Nails, R. Texas, was very direct about the old rules being a bottleneck. He noted that current FAA restrictions, which have remained unchanged since 1973, broadly prohibit commercial supersonic flight over land without special authorization.
He's basically saying the law was written for the era of the Concorde, which was famously loud and inefficient. Now, with NASA's X-59 testing and private companies like Boom Supersonic, the House is betting that the thump can replace the boom.
It's a rare moment where both parties agreed to look past the immediate political fires to fund a vision of the 2030s. If the FAA meets that 2027 deadline for the rules, we might actually see these planes in the air by the end of the decade.
A 2-hour flight. to the West Coast certainly beats the current 6-hour slog. And with that look at the future of flight, we're closing the book on yesterday's record.
I'm Reed.
And I'm Paige. We'll be back tomorrow to see if the Senate can find any of that same bipartisan speed. Thanks for listening to Floor Notes Extended. But before we truly close the book on yesterday's record, there is a significant fiscal anchor being dropped that we need to address. For those wondering how we'll pay for the new wars and the old debts, Senator Barrasso introduced the Dollar for Dollar Act yesterday.
It's a bold piece of institutional engineering. This is a bill that would make it a procedural crime to raise the debt limit without cutting a matching amount of spending first. It essentially tries to hardwire fiscal restraint into the very mechanics of the Senate floor.
It shifts the entire burden of proof for the Appropriations Committee. What stands out here is how it would effectively force a one-to-one trade-off every time the Treasury hits a wall. If this gains any real traction, the era of the blank check might finally be meeting its match.
It's the ultimate put your money where your mouth is legislation. It turns every conversation about future growth into a debate about current sacrifice, which is going to be a major friction point as we head toward the next budget cycle. It's definitely the story to watch in the coming weeks.
That's Floor Notes Extended for today.
Stay curious, and we'll catch you when the next gavel falls.